Hi, I'm Emily Gong, and this is Beyond Codes and Aesthetics, a podcast series of Art Focus Spoken, where we feature the voices of international artists, curators, and scientists in exploring innovative possibilities that engage with society through art and science. On today's episode, we are excited to speak with Kimberly Glassman, a Montreal-born art historian, curator, and digital communicator, currently living in Oxford. Kim obtained her BFA in Art History and Psychology at Concordia University and completed her Master's of Studies in the History of Art and Visual Culture at the University of Oxford. Kim has worked at the McCord Museum, Concordia University, the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling, the SBC Gallery of Contemporary Art, the Museum of Jewish Montreal, the Convergence Initiative, and the North Wall Art Center. Kim has rich research and curating experiences in bridging and exploring the art-science relationship, and it's a pleasure to welcome Kim to speak with us about this. Thanks so much for joining us today, Kim. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Emily. I'm so excited to talk about this. You know how much I love to talk about art and science.
We're going to learn a lot, too, from you about this topic. And so, how has these few months been like for you in Oxford?
It's been bittersweet, honestly, because as you mentioned, I've worked in many museums and galleries, and they're obviously in a bit of a pickle right now. Right now I work at the North Wall Art Center, and we've been closed for most of it, but the silver lining is I've been able to take up more remote volunteer work, such as with one of the initiatives I'll talk about more in our conversation, the Convergence Initiative. So it's been really interesting to see how digitally the art world has kind of come together and how they've tried to persevere in these few months. And I've been trying to keep positive on seeing how that innovation is emerging, and it'll come up in little pockets of areas that, honestly, we're going to talk about today. It's very on point.
Exactly, and because you've been doing digital communications for a while, but over these few months with, the physical closing of museums and galleries and the rise of virtual exhibits, how have you witnessed that, and what are your thoughts on it?
I've definitely seen a pressure put on museums that maybe were also stuck in the past for this digital accessibility and the democratization of access to artworks, not only historically, but the contemporary art world, which usually stayed in the high art market bracket. And we saw how Sotheby's Christie's had to go online, as well as one of Miami's Art Basel also had to go online, and the whole economic part of the art world had to alter how it functioned, but persevered. And museums, likewise, in their education facilities, they've had to start thinking through social media lenses. How are they going to interact with their audiences of various ages, ranging from families to specialists, historians, people who want to access the archives, and how to get a virtual experience of your kind of weekend stroll down the city when you go as maybe a tourist or a local and you walk into your local museum. And more often you're seeing really interesting projects emerge online. And I was struck by, I think it was the Royal Shakespeare Company who coined this phrase, "the show must go online," instead of "the show must go on." And I think it has this silver lining where obviously it would be amazing to go and enter these spaces right away. But given the circumstances, to have this new innovation or pressure to make museums go online will have repercussions, I think, that they'll have to take forward when we do return to the space. And there will be, I think, a more seamless blend between the physical and the digital and how we interact with art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I understand that you have a very dynamic role at the North Wall Art Center. So how has it been like there? Have you guys done virtual shows? And how's your experience?
So working with the North Wall Art Center, my primary goals with visitor experience. And a lot of that entailed working in person with people as they came into the space. So when lockdown hit, and in Oxford, we were in lockdown for almost a month, and we had to close before everyone was put on furlough. My job was primarily to put out engaging digital content that could be shared. So it was a way to look at our artists and say, well, and more than just visiting the artist and reading the biography, how does it relate to a history of art? How does it relate to something else going on in the world? And to have question prompts of how we can make something short and snippy on Instagram and maybe get people to comment on the art, this other type of engagement that goes back and forth. We also did some podcasts, which have seen a huge rise. Podcasts are just exploding now. Like this one. Yeah, exactly. And, I did an interview with Peter Lawrence, who is with the Engravers Society, which is based here in London and Oxford. And, he gave a full account of the process of engraving and his work, and we were able to put that audio along with some of the visuals. And then you have this blend of content that maybe we wouldn't have even been able to provide when people physically go to the space. So I think we've been taking notes of some digital methods that we've employed that we will continue when we go back. And I'm set to start back at work actually this coming Monday, the Monday, by the time this airs, it will be in the past, but set to go back to work. And we are having conversations of how to digitize the gallery. And I've been in conversation with some of my friends in Montreal, back home, who've worked at Concordia University, for example, in the VAV gallery, which is connected to it, on these digitizing platforms that allow you to kind of not just scroll, but physically move through a three-dimensional space. And the Modern Art Oxford Museum is an excellent example. They do really great virtual exhibitions in this manner, and it gives you a kind of spatial awareness of artworks rather than just seeing them two-dimensionally on a page. So I think in that direction is where I hope I could help the Art Center grow to.
That sounds really exciting. I remember just like a year or two ago when I was speaking to you, you were already thinking about how to like digitalize shows so that they live beyond the short period of a month or two or three that they're up. And so like, what do you think are like key components of digitalizing to make it more of a engaging experience that's as much as you can in online type of media?
Yeah, I think having the space to store digitally the artworks is the first one. You need to have a very interactive interface, but it can't be too overwhelming. So if you go to like the Google Arts page right now, you can click on everything. If you look and there's a painting of a tree will be highlighted. You can click on tree and it'll bring you to other things. Same with the art movements and the years and the artists. And that can be a bit overwhelming. You don't know how to engage with it if you're just going to have a browse. If you're looking for something in particular, it's very useful. So I think that when you're thinking of digital access, it's about who it's accessible to, who your target is. Once you have a target, that interface, in my opinion, should be designed to service it. For museums, it's often a bracket, maybe young families, and then you have 18 to 25 or 26, and then you have other age brackets, and usually you divide up who's accessible when to what content. But once you have that interface, it's about sharing it. And now I do think that what the fashion industry has already done, and I'm not saying the fashion industry and the art industry are the same, but leaning into social media, using that visual platform like Instagram as a sharing mechanism, which a lot of museums have started to do, is a way to bring people into those interfaces, because I find we don't often now peruse Google looking for a website to look at. We'll go on Instagram, and as we scroll through, we'll see something interesting, and then we'll click into it, or Facebook or Twitter. So I do think social media is not going anywhere anytime soon. I think once you have a strong interface where the artwork is accessible, it's then about bringing people into that interface and making it super engaging with various media. So not just having the still image, but you also, you want to have a bit of a voice clip. You want to have a bit of background, a bit of history, and more importantly, you want to explain the physicality of it and the medium, because kind of like what art historians do when they write about art, we're bringing to the reader or viewer something that they can't have right in front of them, because you're not physically in front of the artwork, but that does not mean you can't take away from it what anyone else can who goes to the museum.
Mm-hmm. And at the beginning, when I was seeing a lot of virtual shows, it's really difficult when it's just maybe of like painting after painting, like photos of it, and you just browse through like a slideshow. Then it kind of loses that quality of, engagement of when you're looking in front of a work of art and there's nothing else and there's no other tabs and distractions. But with the visual aid, it sounds like then it's a more immersive experience that appeals more of your senses. And so then, like, what is is there a targeted time of like that the description is however long for like one work of art? Is there to think about like how one person usually how long they spent in front of a piece of painting or another artwork?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question because, like you said, seeing things on a slide going, by one to one to one to the next, it's not that engaging. And that idea of being immersed into an environment and almost the idea of like escaping into an artwork, into a gallery, was one of the functions of museums. It was, well, originally in the 19th century to tell everyone else apparently what style was. But apart from that, it was to give this journey of escapism from their life, especially in the rise of the industrial era. And so having a virtual version of that is really important, and how to accomplish it, and how to really get people to be immersed while looking at their screens, is, like I said, to have that physicality. I think one of the best examples I've seen of that is the Natural History Museum here in Oxford, which I got a chance to see, a few months ago before all this happened. And they had a great answer to a question, which kind of follows with what you're talking about, which is if we make everything online, why do we need to go to the museum? So you want to say, well, everything's accessible online and you can have this immersive experience, but don't discount actually going to these buildings that the curator spends so long working on. And so what they do is they have an app, and you go to the museum and you can engage with this content at home, but you can only unlock certain pieces of information if you scan the actual work. So they have, for example, the chalkboard with, E equals MC squared that, it's written on, and if you scan it, it gives you all this background information, and it gives you a voice clipping from a curator, I believe, that explains the work a bit more. So it has this engagement of, being virtual and physical. I think that interplay is really important. It doesn't cut anyone off, but it also doesn't give people an excuse to never go into those buildings, because we do need to keep people into the buildings. I think that's very important as well. I don't know if I answered your question just there. I think I went on a tangent.
Yeah. Oh, no worries. I think it's just really fascinating topics to explore, and also if like this virtual medium will carry on going forwards and become a permanent channel where then it'll increase access to, like, people can visit from the comforts of their home even after things calm down with COVID and such. So yeah, do you think that this will just be a permanent channel going forward?
I think it will always, from here on out, I think it will be a consideration. I think for the departments that used to kind of sandwich social media under marketing in a small category, they will begin to grow. I worked I worked for the McCord under Marie-Lise Paquin when she was the social media manager, and we were like a facet under the group of digital comms, under communications, under marketing. It was, like this subdivision. And even then, one of my first jobs working for her was they take turns doing presentations of each department to the rest of the department at the McCord. And I had to explain why marketing was important. I had to put the PowerPoint together to be like, your money is going somewhere valuable. And that's where I think marketing in museums and how digital communication gets a kind of sandwiched in between curation, marketing, and education. So it doesn't have this clear place to sit because it incorporates all of it. But I think it will grow and kind of assert its space going forward for various reasons that were already present. I mean, the just increased digitization of the world in general. But now with the current situation, I think more than ever, it will be here to stay. And I hope it does get the funding to do so, because it can be quite time consuming, and to produce good quality work, which I think, should be the case, it does require funding as well.
Yeah, it's really important going forward. And I wonder too if there will be more, I guess, innovations to provide for other mediums of art, because it's not just like paintings, but there's sculptures, installations, new media, and things that engage with not just with other disciplines. So I wonder too if there'll be kind of more ways to show and allow for it, because I know one of the key challenges, like for instance, with graduating shows this year, unfortunately, a lot of them had to move online. But then there's a really big challenge into how to accommodate some of the artists' works into that digital medium. And with a wealth of different formats, like I wonder what are there some considerations that you've thought about?
For the graduates, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that at the university level, and then going forward, for graduates that are working in the arts, and especially in art science with new media, they are, well, they're having a difficulty now with obviously building a portfolio if they're working with very physical medium, if their work is supposed to be presented in public, or even getting into those gallery spaces. I think that the push again to translate your work into a way where you can communicate it online, or build your artistic profile on Instagram, for instance, which is how today I find a lot of the artists that I follow, especially who tag themselves as, sci artist or artist scientists. And I do think this is used as a vehicle for networking and a vehicle for connection, which in the world of art and science, when you're trying to bring together artists and scientists, however you define those terms, the hashtag is so useful. It's so simple, so eloquent. The art science in one word that you can search. And, if you're a graduate student and you put a piece of work up online, or even a work in progress, because I know it's another issue entirely to put finished work online that is not paid for because you don't want someone to copy it, but even work in progress for the studio, and then have that tag that enters you into this community. This online community, even without you having to search for it, because your hashtag has entered you into that. And I find the whole concept of hashtags and grouping and online communities fascinating, but I'll try not to talk about it too much. But I do think that going forward, there should be always an accompaniment to graduate exhibitions, especially when they're just going out into their professional world. To have accompanying exhibition catalogs, to have ways to photograph your work, or work with mediums that can translate to be shown in some way. And this can be video-based, because we have amazing artistic works that are dance, sound related, or that can be photographed that are sculptural, and so on and so forth. There was a graduate show that I looked at that was published online. It was for... I'm going to send you the link, but it was for, I believe, the Royal College London. I will send you the link though, but it was this exhibition, and it was focused on art and science, and they published, it was a very simple interface, so I wasn't, wowed by the interface, but I scrolled through and was able to look at each of the works, and it was reflections of lockdown, and you had some beautiful pieces of digitally rendered, NHS workers with their faces blurred out, and questioning how we dehumanize the medical staff, because they are, superheroes to us, or they are the fixers, they're not the people. And so there's really interesting commentary from these scientists at Royal College London exploring themselves artistically. And so there have been methods, like I think graduate students have still been able to showcase their work, but it's been a struggle. And I do think that, like we were talking about with having museum interfaces, if those become more accessible, universities and other galleries can still exhibit online. I don't think the answer is to never stop exhibiting. I think it's just how, and in what way, and to highlight those mediums.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a key point to take forward too for art students or artists or even scientists to have that type of digital portfolio, and one where it's just not only like photos, but maybe other ways, so people can also experience their work, not just as an archive to refer back to. And you mentioned art science. So can we get onto that topic, and can you share a bit about
please.
What is ArtScience Collaboration, essentially?
Mm-hmm. Well, just for a bit of background to anyone listening. So I'm first and foremost an art historian, and I'm approaching this conversation as an art historian. I've looked at the history of science and the history of art, specifically with color theory and how we perceive colors. And in my work and in talking to various artists, scientists, collaborating together with communities that I've worked with, this really interesting thing about art-science convergence or collaboration is almost the necessity of holding those pillars steady and strong in order for them to collaborate. For instance, you couldn't have two things that were the same collaborate. That would just be the same. And so, interestingly enough, it's the expertise that's offered by the artist, by the scientist, that gives such a fruitful gathering, a fruitful meeting. But with the terms art and science, they're really troublesome for me, as I'm sure they are for many. I mean, the term art itself was a 19th century invention. Before that, art, or like arts in the Latin, was actually craft. And before that, art was, if you were an artist, it's because you were a craftsperson. You worked with your hands, like the painters, the sculptors. And so artist was completely different. It was only after you had Alberti's Lives of the Artist. Sorry, that took a second. His book, Lives of the Artist, where he started to talk about, the genius artists, his friends, Michelangelo, Raphael, that he was like, no, these are, the artists. And that word took on different meaning. And it was only in about 1833 when William Whewell used the term scientist as a way to group different professions that were emerging, such as like the engineer, the mathematician, the biologist, and all these different ones. And he would say, as the painter, musician, and sculptor is an artist, so is the engineer, mathematician, and biologist a scientist. And I'm paraphrasing those examples, but he said that to give a weight to the other side, because he saw these things that were like each other, but different specializations, and were grouped already under the term kind of the art. And whereas everything was considered an art, because an art was a way to craft your skill. So if you were skillful in something, it was an art. But Whewell kind of put that away to group these specific things that were taking on what was being developed as the scientific method, and finding the more empirical truth in the world as they saw it, and leading to the Enlightenment that the word scientist kind of emerged. Because scientia just used to mean knowledge. So those words definitely took a divergence, but not as far back as we think. So a lot of the examples, and the reason I love looking at the history, is because the examples will show just how taking skill and taking knowledge they're not opposing principles. They actually are incorporated into each. Just one has grown into this as this kind of a creative, emotional industry of the arts, versus the kind of cold, and not cold in a negative way, but the needing it to be objective in as much as it can be. Lacking the person and more the results of the science and the scientist. And that divergence, which, C.P. Snow did in his Two Cultures lecture, talking about those two different things, and how we combine them, it sounds like you're trying to move mountains to bring two antithetical concepts together, when really, if we go back to the roots of those words and the roots of the beginnings, then you are bringing people together with their version of their expertise to inquire about the world, which is how it all started. So forget the beginning of your question, but when I think of art and science, I get stuck in this terminology, because finding a common ground is finding a common language. And I find that if we talk about the origin of this language and we're able to explore those terms, it brings people closer together. We don't feel as isolated from each other. So that's what I like to do a lot when I look into the history of art and the history of science. What did it mean in their time, and how can we learn from that today?
And then what about today? Like, how are we seeing this type of collaboration? Because like you said, sometimes they're seen as very opposing, but then it could also be us kind of to categorize different things so that we can understand them better, but sometimes this categorization goes the opposite of its effect.
This is very true. And the categorization, I believe, is not something we're going to dispel. We're not going to say art and science are the same, nor do I think we should. I think the hyphen in art science is really interesting because it's bringing two things together. And I think, like I said, and what Wellel pointed out with the specializations, is it is two different expertise coming together. And you see really amazing results from that. I've seen them mostly in residencies. You have artist in residence or scientist in residence. I think in 2017 you had, on a more famous scale, you had, oh, of course I'm blanking on his name, but at the Neuroscience Institute at Columbia University, you had a prolific contemporary artist. I can't remember.
We can attach the link afterwards, don't worry. Yeah.
Okay.
Or if you wanted to pull anything up to show us too, that also works. Feel free to do that at any time.
It's really bothering me. I'll give the link, but someone from big in the contemporary art world who had shown at museums just around the world, working with, under the supervision of famous neuroscientist Eric Kandel, Jeff Koons, the artist Jeff Koons working with Eric Kandel, or not directly, but under supervision. You have these great videos that came out of the conversations between them, and he did these works where it was these reflective sculptures, and it was the work of the neuroscientists talking about their work, and Jeff Koons being inspired by it, and then I think he even exhibited it or put them up in the neuroscience lab so that it reflected other things, which is very fascinating, and the whole investigation into perception and how the material reacts. So a residency, I think, is a great way we're seeing today. They give us space. And like I said, I think having that space is really important. The space basically says, okay, you are allowed to enter this world because we feel very cut off. And when you have a space that says artists and scientists can come here for the purpose of both being here, they're able to open up. And that is where I think you have these amazing collaborations come through. I remember one of the exhibitions I did in 2018 at Concordia with the Art Matters Festival. I curated alongside two others. We did, it was called Disconnect, it was called Disconnect, the Alienation of Art and Science. And we had these amazing students presenting it's like the germination of their artistic careers. And I'm still in touch with a few of them today. And there was this space, we basically said, we want your work because it is at this weird intersection between art, science, technology. It doesn't yet have its categorizations, just a couple of years ago now. But one in particular, Geoffrey Beauregard, he did these great drawings, kind of in a classic Enlightenment style of drawing different plants in his backyard, very accurately, as you would see in natural history textbooks. And then he also drew these individual people kind of going around it, and it was a series. And as the people these little people enveloped it, it started to die. And he was studying to be a biologist, and he switched into a fine arts track. But with him, he carried his the ethics and all of his feelings about this very scientific field, but he didn't have a place to put it. Only later did he find it, and again, in a space where you could. And Concordia University is a very interdisciplinary university. So, I mean, those are just a couple examples, but there's so many just all over the world. I mean, if you look at Le Laboratoire in Paris, which was founded by David Edwards, who wrote a phenomenal book called Art Science in the Post-Google Generation. Art Science Creativity in the Post-Google Generation, sorry. He does fascinating case studies of individuals who have transitioned from art to science or science to art, put themselves in both camps, and found that they can, when given the opportunity, kind of bring them together into these insane discoveries. I jotted it down because I didn't want to forget their name, but one of the examples that he mentions is, Diana Dabby. And so Diana Dabby was a concert pianist who read a series of articles on future trends in music that was written by engineers. And she thought that she might be able to pioneer her art better by understanding the science of her art. And so she went to study electrical engineering at MIT. And only after struggling for years with the complexities of chaos theory did you see a parallel between the patterns that surrounded the theory of a mathematical strange attractor and those of musical variation on theme. So she mapped the notes onto the solutions to chaos equations and not only provided a new way to view chaos, but then a new composition technique as well. So, I mean, his book, I would highly recommend it if you're interested in looking at individuals that carry the art and science within them. But I do think it's a lot more common and probably more accessible to a wide variety of practitioners to have those residency spaces with tools that you can use to bring your art and science inquiries together, because it can feel quite daunting, especially if you're maybe an artist who's never, who's wanted to approach the sciences, but you feel like it's just, it's too boarded up. You don't know how to knock on the door. And likewise for scientists who don't know how to approach the arts because they have been told maybe to focus their research and their inquiries in only one direction. And that their direction has to matter. You don't often hear science for science sake nowadays. So on both sides, I think having that common space is just immensely important.
And it's really cool to hear about some of the projects that you've mentioned. And then from all the ones that you've talked a little bit about, I see a pattern where at this intersection of art, tech, and science, you have projects where the art contributes to the science and the science contributes to the art. So what are I guess, hallmarks of this type of collaboration, and are there certain points that make it an art-science collaboration or art-tech collaboration under this?
That's an interesting question. Historically, one of the markers that stands out to me was actually the focus point of my supervisor's focus, which was on George Kippisch, who was the first artist in residence at MIT. And this was kind of one of the first instances that you had a clear name for it. He was there as an artist in residence to look at the technology, and he would do amazing close-up photography and would publish it. It would just be fascinating because he would turn these very functional things into very beautiful works. And that was an interesting relationship that MIT still has to this day. I mean, MIT has been the forerunner on things like wearable technology, which does come from artists who can work with textiles, melding with technological innovation. So that's definitely one that sticks out in my mind, as well as a lot of architectural theory, which I'm less familiar with, but I know that the design of architecture, which does in its essence straddle the sciences and the arts, the artistic design of a building with the science required to make sure that it's going to stand up is just at that point. And I myself am not a specialist in architecture, but I know many friends who will talk for days about it. Most recently, I think the buzzwords around this would be neuroscience and neuroaesthetics as one of them. Speaking more about the visual arts, music has been more intertwined, I feel, with science and mathematics specifically for longer, as I mentioned with Darby's example. But with the visual arts and neuroscience, it seems like this culmination of questions about aesthetics. The neuroscientist at one point said, and I think it starts with about Samir Zeki in 1990, I think he published one of the works. Probably goes a bit further back, but around 1990, I'd say, is when it became buzzworthy for the first time. And he talks about, what if we can find in our brain where it pings and lights up when we look at something beautiful? And it born this, it started this theory of neuroaesthetics where they're looking for it. Okay, can we find it? And now there are a lot of issues with it on the scientist side, on the artist side. There's still no conclusion, but what it did was it opened the floodgates to all these questions and all these possibilities. It's a marker, I think, where neuroscience, which is what is believed by many as the truth-telling kind of science, it tells us what connections happen in our brain, and people don't really doubt the science when they hear, oh, it's a neuroscientific explanation. Being able to reduce art to an explanation. Okay, we know what's good and what's bad, or rather, what they believe is beautiful. However, as we know, with artists, starting as back as Marcel Duchamp, art is not always supposed to be beautiful. It can provoke. It can be ugly. They said, we had artists, especially the postmodernists, saying, well, art should be about truth and the human condition, and that's not always pretty. So neuroaesthetics does have its own issues, and I am very interested to see where it goes in the future. But out of that came neuroart. And neuroart is another field where you actually just take images of the brain and show them as artistic works. Because often a gel, a particular gel, which name's escaping me, it's like silver, is used, you can color them to track what's happening in the brain. That's usually how the scans work. So you have this kind of trace of what's lighting up in your brain. And there have been great investigations, and I think it's the Wellcome Trust, I have to double check, but there is an annual contest for brain images, and they're seen as artworks. So you do have this kind of obsession with the brain aesthetics and the visual arts that all come together, and I think it's a modern day hallmark. Ignoring, which I tend to, like Leonardo da Vinci, which a lot of people think, well, da Vinci was the epitome of art and science, and in many ways he was, but in his time, that was seen as his craft. It was his skill. And there were others, maybe not as prolific, but that also engaged in those activities in recording the natural world. So when I look at the modern world, where we're fighting barriers or trying to either find the science behind art or art used in science, those are those hallmarks that stick with me in my mind. And I say, oh my God, someone is just trying tooth and nail to get to something. And I think they're onto it. I think that we won't find out maybe, what pings in our brain when we look at art. But I do think that using the technologies like those used by neuroscience and having neuroscientists explain visual perception to artists and artists vice versa has great opportunities.
Do you think in your art that there's the space for scientists and artists to learn each other's perception and for that to influence their work?
I think so, and one of the best examples I found of that was working with the Convergence Initiative, because we posed that question exactly, and we did it. So when I say we did it, we decided to, instead of theorizing about it, we brought artists and neuroscientists together. And so in the project, which started in 2016 by Dr. Christian Seltzer, who's a neuroscientist, and he does graphic art and stained glass work. He is based at McGill, and he brought me on, and we had a group of artists from Concordia and neuroscientists from McGill. And they, before we even started their collaborative project, they did a 5-minute talk series, each of them. So the scientists had to boil down their work into 5 minutes to explain to the artists, and the artists likewise had to boil down what they were working on to the scientists. And together, afterwards, they would kind of pair up based on their common interests and create something entirely new. And it happened for the first time in 2016, which I was involved in, and it's been going on every year since, even after I've moved away. Christian has a great team of volunteers with him, and the artists and scientists seem to want it. That's the part that I find so interesting. I spent time interviewing them as the project happened in 2016. And I remember talking to one neuroscientist in particular, who he'd been working on scientific experiments that required him to dissect mice and the brain of mice. And he tells me that, he's a vegetarian. He says he believes in animal rights and he doesn't believe in eating meat. He goes, it makes my work so important because every time I sacrifice an animal, it's for a cause. It's for, a search for, X, Y, or Z. And he talks about how he didn't have an outlet to express that because it's just so bottled up because it's you get it passed by an ethics committee, an ethics board, it's rationalized, and then you go ahead with it. And it was interesting talking to him because you could see all of this, there's stuff around the science that I don't think we always talk about. I think that's where art has its place. And that kind of goes into a theory that was presented by Bruno Latour called actor network theory, which it looks at all of the connections, what he calls actants, around a scientific discovery or the act of employing a scientific method to find a scientific discovery. And it's in that I investigate, that I probe, because I think the artists also know to probe there. I think that is where the arts come in and complete a picture in a sense, fill in some gaps. They make it human because science is human. I don't think it is stats on a paper. I think it really is human.
That's really well said. And I'm really curious to hear about how you, as with an art history background, came to the sciences yourself.
Yeah, so I actually love telling this story because I've always been interested in interdisciplinarity. I did a liberal arts degree before I went into art history, and while I was studying art history, I did do a minor in psychology, and I tended my interest focused towards neuropsychology of vision. Was a huge focus of mine, and for a time I was interested in arts therapy, which is usually what people think of when they hear, oh, you're doing psychology and art, so you must be going to be like an art therapist. And I considered it. I worked as an assistant dance therapist for a bit, but I came across at one of the Concordia used book sales David Edwards' book, Creativity in the Post-Google Generation, the book on art science. And reading it, I was fascinated because something had just clicked. It was like, I had always thought that psychology, specifically at that time I was looking at psychology and the arts had this connection, but I didn't want to be an art therapist and I didn't know how else I could engage with it. And that book was my first opening into it. And, later that year, so I started my undergraduate in 2015. By 2016, by chance, Christian had put out the class, Convergence Initiative, Perceptions of Neuroscience. And it was actually directed towards artists. They wanted the art students to come and say, oh, I would love to join. And I was in art history, not in the visual arts, but I showed up and I said, you're going to need someone to coordinate between these artists and scientists. You're going to need someone to write about their works and to interview them. And I want to be that person right in the middle, bridging that gap, talking about it, and we've remained close friends and good colleagues ever since. So I think that was definitely what started me on that route. And another key moment, I feel like I'm babbling, but another key moment that still sticks with me to this day is my first lecture I had on the psychology of perception. My professor gave us this textbook that he would use in all his slides called Sensation and Perception. And at the introduction for each section was an artwork, which I found very interesting. And by the time we got to the lecture on visual perception, the front cover was a pointillist work by Camille Pissarro. And it was explaining optical mixture theory. So how we see two separate colors very close together. And when we see it from afar, our eyes, our visual perception, blends it. So you see blue next to yellow, and they're separate, but we still see green, even without it being mixed with paint. And this was used as a tool. The art was used as a tool to explain the science. This led me in my master's, which I finished just a couple years ago. It led me to look at Pissarro's work as a type of scientific medium, of how you can access the science in the artwork. I was completely enamored with it. And the more I dug, the more I found. I worked with the Pissarro Family Archives in the Ashmolean Museum and found Pissarro's writings where he said the other pointillist artists like Seurat, they're not scientific enough. I want to do something that is methodological. I want to take these colors and there's method to it. And it was fascinating because it was something as simple as a visual aid that began it. You know, a visual aid in a psychology class, which everyone can do. And it's, when you think about it hard, and I think about the theory of it, of theoretically speaking, you know, how do we access science and art and the paintings and what can they offer us and the viewer relation to, you know, a piece of work, which can get very theory heavy, especially studying at Oxford. Coming out of that after and thinking about what I was looking at, I always came back to, it's like a means of communicating both the art and science in a very simple way when we don't overthink it. You can look at Pissarro's work and look at the pointillism, which is just painting that's made of small dots, and use it to explain optical mixture theory, which the artist was aware of because he was using texts written by Eugène Chevreuil, which is the Chevreulian color theory, which explains simultaneous color contrast. It explains how we do blend those and how the difference by putting one color next to the other can make one appear brighter or one appear darker. So it just gets fascinating the more you look at it and unravel it, and it's never black and white, I think. But that's the rabbit hole I went down, and I'm still going. So that's how I got into it.
I understand that you're starting a PhD on color theory at the Queen's Mary University, London. And I'm also curious when you mentioned your initial interest in art therapy. So has that interest kind of reappeared in your research on color theories, for instance? Because I was just I see a lot of studies that in why there's art shown in hospitals and how there's proof that uplifts the mood and the health and the overall state of patients there because they're exposed and see the art every day. And there are certain categories of art that's displayed there. So I wonder if there's your initial interest that reappears in your research now.
Yeah, it definitely does. And art therapy is still interesting to me. It interests me as a discipline. I just don't think I'd be trained as an art therapist. But, you know, when I was entertaining the idea in my undergrad, I did do some research on color theory used with Alzheimer's patients in painting the rooms. And there was just this consensus of certain colors, I think it was yellows and blues, that were just more appealing overall to patients who perhaps couldn't express themselves and what their preferences were. And it was just like a general look at how to keep people calm. And so studies like that, you know, still come across during my research, and I enjoy them thoroughly. But more poignantly to my research, when I was looking at Pissarro's work, I was comparing it to a contemporary artist named Robert Pepperell, who I had the pleasure of interviewing for the Renaissance Lab project with Convergence, which I think will be published later this month. But he had a question that art therapists do need to engage with, and that's with certain psychological issues in the brain when there's something has a damage. So, for example, someone who has damage to their FFA, the fusiform face area, that is the part of our visual cortex that that allows us to recognize faces. And more broadly, if we can't recognize faces and maybe other objects, it's called visual agnosia. And Robert Pepperell questioned this haze, this fuzz that people with visual agnosia see, and he said, can I induce that through painting? Can I have other people experience it who don't have that damage to their brain? And the inquiry of how we perceive the world, how our brain understands it, and the tricks you can play on your brain was fascinating. He ended up working with Alumi Ishai and her neuroscience lab in Zurich to do studies where he would make what he would call these indeterminate paintings. So these paintings vaguely resembled 16th, 17th century masterpieces, as in he would copy the color scheme and the general movements, but you couldn't identify any one point. There'd be, for instance, swirls of what looked like flesh, and the more you look, you're trying to identify anything. And unlike an abstract work, your brain falls short. So usually when you're trying to identify objects, this is a very simplified version, but your brain will group all of the lines together, will look for motion, and with those collected objects, it will try and connect something to, sorry, I'm just checking that, yeah, it's still, that will try and connect it to a referent. So, you look at a table, you realize it's a table, or even identifying an object and saying, I don't know what that is. Once you get there, if you don't know what it is, you can interpret it, and it goes kind of more to an imaginative state. But Pepperell was trying to hold you there, in the middle. Can't decide if you know it, can't decide if you don't. And that is predominantly the feeling that people get with visual agnosia. If you are looking for a good book about what that is like, there's, I forget who it's by, but the man who mistook the man who mistook his wife's head for a hat, which is a very fascinating book that explains that, and one that I believe Pepperell knew about. But that also makes, I'm realizing now talking to you that this particular visual agnosia and prosopagnosia, which is the one of not being able to see faces, was particularly interesting to me because I also did a project looking at Chuck Close. And Chuck Close is a brilliant artist who, because he can't identify faces, he breaks down photographs of people into almost like pixelated boxes, and he paints them all individually, and from afar, kind of like in the pointless works, it all comes together and your brain makes sense of what you're looking at. But being up close and trying to make sense is kind of how he sees people's faces. They don't really correlate to the people he knows. He recognizes them by voice. So in those ways, there are places in arts therapy that have brilliantly been explored by artists, and I think that is a super interesting area, not just how the arts from a psychological point of view are being used to help people, but how the artists themselves, sometimes who suffer from different either developmental disabilities or who have some brain damage in some way, use the arts as a vehicle to explore, confront, and express what's going on. And though Robert Pepperell doesn't personally have any of these, again, he is drawing from some of that research from his neuroscience colleagues as well.
That's so fascinating. And I know that you have a lot of experience both curating arts exhibits and as well as curating art science exhibits. What are your experiences with both, and differences when you're thinking about one or the other?
So when I think of curation in general, it is building a story and a narrative for people who come in. And I think pairing things together is mainly the curator's job. You're making sense of things that are already interesting and beautiful. It's just about bringing them together. And sometimes that heightens how they talk to each other. I do think that artworks in a room, they talk to each other, and that's what can be so immersive and so brilliant. Just before I talk about my own work, I was recently in Vienna last year for a conference, and I remember going to the museum, and you walk in and there's these beautiful, like Gustav Klimt paintings, and they have right next to them headphones to put on to listen to the great masters of the era. Vienna's high renaissance of composers. And of course, it doesn't dawn on you till you're there, but now I can't unsee it, that of course you would have these paintings in grand stately homes with the music playing. It's the culture, the atmosphere. And though in not that exact way, that inspires a lot of my work, and having that, beyond the bare white cube, it's a space, and that space is to be felt, touched, lived in almost. Not the artworks themselves, but it should be that kind of experience, at least I hope that I create things like that. And the first time I explored it was with the Art Matters Festival in that I already mentioned, the Disconnect exhibition. It was held at Espace Pop, which is in Montreal, and it was just a fairly tiny room. We didn't really know what we were going to do with it, but we had a launch party because we were working with Nuit Blanche at the time, which is an annual arts festival in Montreal. And we had these artists, and I remember strategically walking around the space, and we ended up organizing it so that when you walk in, we had on a plinth this kind of arm. It was a glove that was on a stand. And it was kind of perplexing because it was actually used in a performance that happened every half hour or so by the artist who stayed in the space, because he used the hand to play music. He had computed it, and it was linked to his computer. So he was conducting and playing the music, because as he was conducting, he was controlling different notes. It didn't sound maybe as melodious as, us going to a concert, but the technology behind the artistic vision of what if I can compose and play at the same time is brilliant. But so you walk in and see this hand, and my idea with that was literally to pull you in and turn you to the left, because we had this brilliant opposition of, like, on the right side, we had these drawings by an artist in Montreal who just did these heart-wrenchingly beautiful sketches of mental illness. So she had one on depression, on anxiety, on anorexia, and it was a personal expression. It was very, very personal and intense, and they were quite small, so you had to go up to them to physically look closer at them. So I gave them a lot of space because I wanted you to have to engage with it closely, because mental illness is difficult and it is uncomfortable, and the space was to reflect that. And opposite it, we had this corner that kind of was a complete contrast. Instead of the stark wall, we had beanbag chairs and these old retro TVs with string lights up, and we had this great artist who goes by the name of Gar, but her name is Diana Lazaro, and she took EEG scans of her brain when she was inducing different emotions in herself, so like happiness, fear, sadness, and then when you take an EEG scan, it gives you like different pinpoints. It's like a diagram, so it'll show highs and lows, and the science behind it is not something I've looked at extensively, but when we looked at her work, what was so fascinating was she took those results, and then she, kind of in the same way that our first artist made music from his hand, she made music from these scanned results, and then overlaid an RGB color scheme on a TV screen that would complement it. And though when you listen to it, it's quite jarring, and so are the images, sitting in that comfortable space and hearing and seeing something that was recorded from inside your brain, kind of translated through these different technologies, while looking at this very personal expression of some of those intense feelings, was ways that they could talk to each other. These works could talk to each other without us having to say it. You're sitting, listening, and the TVs were kind of positioned outward so that they can talk. And then all the while, we had this big screen down at the back of the gallery space, and it was a project by these two artists, Timothy Thomason and Owen Coolidge, and they took Twitter analytics to find it was a map of Montreal with different colors, and the analytics were trying to find, they had I think it was over 8,000 word catalog of finding words that were happy, sad, frustrated, or angry, and you could see where in Montreal in real time people were happy or sad, and you could see those concentrations coming through. So it wasn't almost like a statistical inquiry, but also with people's emotions. It was just a fascinating combination of works. They did not plan this together, and yet the curator's job is to say, you're looking at it through this perspective and touching on the science of maybe health the health the health side of mental illness, and you're looking at how our brain works and different methods we can understand it, and you are looking at data analytics and how can we turn that into almost like an artistic geography, a moving geography, and saying, well, actually, you're all talking about more or less the same thing, and we can explore that in one way by standing in the center of a very tiny room. So that, I mean, that was one of my favorite projects.
Great, and this is a great note to end on. This is such a fascinating topic, and the things that you've mentioned, I feel like we could have a really long discussion that goes hours about it. But it would be really great that we'll put the links to some of the things that you've mentioned down below. And thanks so much for joining us today to share your experiences and to unravel this really fascinating topic. Thanks so much, Kim.
No problem. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks. That's it for this episode of Beyond Codes and Aesthetics. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. Also, please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. Beyond Codes and Aesthetics is produced by Kohei and Translations on Himalaya Podcasts by Will Jiang. Take care and see you next time.